The auction only drew 6 people. It was a Tuesday, the middle of February, and the farm that was being liquidated had been struggling for longer than most people knew. The greenhouse frames went last. 14 of them, bent in places, glazing long gone. The steel oxidized to that particular shade of orange that makes things look like they belong in a scrapyard rather than a bidding sheet. The auctioneer didn't spend much time on them. When the bidding closed, a man named Daniel Carr had purchased all 14 for less than the cost of a used tractor tire. The other 5 people at the auction watched him load the first frame onto his trailer. One of them, a neighboring farmer he'd met once, leaned toward the man beside him and said, just loud enough, "What's he going to do? Build a cage for his regrets?" 14 months later, that same man drove past Daniel Carr's property and slowed his truck to a crawl. Then stopped. Then sat for 6 minutes without moving. Because what he was looking at through the fence was not a cage. It was not a scrapyard. It was the most productive growing operation anyone in that county had seen on soil that had been written off as nearly unfarmable for the better part of 2 decades. And the man who built it was 38 years old, 11 months out of a marriage that had ended badly, and working with a technique that most agricultural textbooks hadn't mentioned since 1987. This is that story. Daniel Carr had spent 12 years as a sous chef in a mid-sized city he never felt entirely at home in. He was good at it. Not famous, not on television, just quietly excellent at the kind of precise, patient work that makes a kitchen function. The work that happens before the food arrives at the table and gets none of the credit afterward. His marriage ended in the spring of his 37th year. He won't say much about it now, and this story won't either. What it will say is this. When it ended, he had enough money for a deposit on a small property, a truck that needed 2 attempts to start, and a very clear sense of what he did not want the next chapter of his life to look like. He found the land through a listing he almost scrolled past. 18 acres. The soil described diplomatically in the listing as presenting opportunities for improvement. What that meant, practically, was this. The ground had been overcropped and undermaintained for so long that the topsoil had compacted into something closer to hardpan than farmable earth. The pH was wrong. The drainage was wrong. The organic matter content was so low it barely registered. Experienced farmers had looked at this land and walked away. Daniel Carr, who had never farmed a day in his life, made an offer the following Monday. His neighbors were polite about their skepticism. Mostly. The exception was Harold Briggs. Harold was 71 years old, had farmed the adjacent property for 43 years, and had a way of looking at land the way a doctor looks at a patient. Not at what it was, but at what it was trying to become. He showed up at Daniel's gate 3 days after the move-in. No invitation, a jar of something he'd preserved from last summer, and a direct question. What are you planning to do with it? Daniel, who had been staring at the compacted field for most of the morning without a clear answer, said honestly, "I'm still figuring that out." Harold looked at the land. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that some older farmers are quiet. Not absence of thought, but thought running faster than speech. Then, "You know what this land reminds me of? A kitchen that nobody's cooked in for 20 years. Everything's still there. The structure's still good. It just needs someone who knows how to use what's been left behind." Daniel looked at him. "You cook?" Harold almost smiled. "Badly." He came back the following week. And the week after. Not to help. Harold was careful about that. Careful not to take over something that wasn't his, but to think out loud beside someone who was listening. He told Daniel about a growing technique he had read about in an old agricultural bulletin from the late 1970s. A system called thermal mass cultivation. The use of dense materials placed strategically around and within growing structures to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through cold nights, extending the growing season by weeks or months in either direction. The technique had been experimented with across parts of Northern Europe and the American Midwest in the late 70s and early 80s. Then cheap energy made it unnecessary. Then everyone forgot about it. The problem, Harold said, is that it only works if the structure is designed right. You'd need something you could configure precisely, not a standard frame. He looked at Daniel. You'd need something like a greenhouse frame, bent out of shape maybe, oxidized, the kind of thing nobody at an auction would want. Daniel did not understand yet. But he filed it away the way a chef files a technique, not for today, but for the moment it becomes relevant. The auction happened 3 weeks later. Daniel had gone for different reasons, looking for a second-hand irrigation pump, a few tools he couldn't afford new. When the greenhouse frames came up, he thought of Harold. He bought all 14. The comment on the way out, a cage for his regrets, reached him clearly. He loaded the first frame without responding. He spent 6 weeks cleaning the frames. Not because he had a plan yet, because he was a chef, and chefs do not begin with recipes. They begin with understanding the ingredients. Every joint, every curve, every rust-compromised section that would need reinforcing before it could hold weight. He cataloged them, drew diagrams, took measurements. Then he went back to Harold. "Walk me through the thermal mass system again." Harold did, this time with drawings. The principle was straightforward in the way that most brilliant agricultural ideas are straightforward. Obvious once explained, invisible until someone explains it. Dense materials, stone, water containers, dark-colored soil beds, placed inside or adjacent to a growing structure, absorb solar radiation during daylight hours. The denser the material, the more heat it holds. At night, as temperatures drop, that stored heat releases slowly back into the growing environment, keeping the air around the plants several degrees warmer than the outside temperature for hours after dark. In practice, this means crops can be started 6 to 8 weeks earlier in spring. It means they can continue producing 4 to 6 weeks later into autumn. It means a growing season of potentially 8 months in a climate that normally offers 5. And it means that the soil inside the structure, warmer, more consistently temperatured, protected from the harshest weather, can be amended and developed faster than exposed ground. The question, Harold said, is whether your frames can be configured to face and angle correctly for maximum solar gain on this specific piece of land. Daniel looked at his diagrams, then at the land, then at the frames. "I'll need to modify them." "Probably. I don't know if I can do that." Harold picked up a pencil. Neither did I, at 38. Daniel worked through that winter. Not gracefully. He made the kind of mistakes that are only visible in retrospect. Welding joints that held for 3 weeks before the weight proved them wrong. Calculating angles that looked correct on paper and failed on frozen ground. He fixed each mistake, not because he was certain it would work, but because Harold came by every Thursday, looked at what had changed, and said the same thing each time. "That's closer. Never that's right. Never that's wrong. Always, that's closer." He was also working on the soil. This part no one saw. Every morning before the sun reached the field, Daniel was out there. Not with purchased amendments at first, he couldn't afford them, but with what the land had. Leaves composted behind the barn, kitchen scraps he'd been saving since autumn, wood ash from the stove, a small quantity of chicken manure from a half-dozen hens he'd acquired in exchange for clearing someone's fence line. Layered, covered, turned, layered again. The thermal mass frames, when they finally went up, were not built over dead ground. They were built over 18 months of someone quietly trying to feed soil that had been starved for 20 years. Harold came to see the completed first structure on a Thursday in early March. He walked around it twice. He put his hand on the modified steel frame. Daniel had reconfigured 4 of the 14 into a single large angled structure, facing south-southwest for maximum winter gain, and felt the difference in temperature between inside and outside. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Plant it next week. It's still February. I know what month it is, Daniel." He planted the following Thursday. Tomatoes, kale, spinach, radishes. A test row of peppers he had no reason to believe would work. The thermal mass materials inside the structure, dark stone containers filled with water, a dark painted barrel that collected the day's heat, beds of dense amended clay, held the night temperature 6 to 8 degrees above the outside air. The crops didn't know it was February. Harold didn't come the following Thursday, or the one after. Daniel called. A woman answered, Harold's daughter, visiting from 3 states away. "He had a fall," she said. "A bad one." Daniel visited. Harold was in a hospital bed in the front room of his house, a compromise, Daniel sensed, between Harold wanting to be home and the daughter wanting him somewhere safer. He looked smaller than Daniel had seen him. But his eyes were the same. "How are the tomatoes?" he asked, before Daniel sat down. "Growing." "This early?" "This early." Harold said nothing for a moment. Then, "Show me when you can." Daniel photographed the plants every 3 days. He brought the photographs to Harold on his next 2 visits. Harold studied each one with the particular attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting, leaning close, tilting the photograph toward the window light, saying almost nothing. On the second visit, looking at a photograph of the pepper row that had no reason to be producing, and was producing anyway, "You know what you've done?" Daniel shook his head. "You've built a climate inside a climate." A pause. "The soil will remember this, even after the frames are gone. Even if you take everything down someday, the soil will remember that it was treated like it could grow something." Harold died 11 days later, on a Thursday. The winter arrived hard that year. The kind of cold that comes fast and stays, temperatures dropping below zero in December and not recovering meaningfully until late February. The farms around Daniel lost early and late crops, lost seedlings that had been started indoors, lost plants that had looked established enough to hold. The county extension office issued 2 advisories about expected yield losses for small operations. Daniel's operation lost nothing. Not one row. The thermal mass structures held their internal temperature through nights that dropped to -8 outside. The amended soil beneath the frames, 18 months of compost, ash, manure, and patience, drained well enough to prevent frost heave and retained enough organic matter to keep biological activity going at temperatures that would have frozen thinner earth solid. When March came, Daniel walked his rows. The kale was the best he had grown. The tomatoes were weeks ahead of anything anyone nearby was starting. The peppers, the ones Harold had seen in the photograph, were still producing. He stood in the middle of the largest structure on a Thursday morning and thought about that. The yields coming out of this ground, soil that 2 years ago had been written off, were running at roughly 3 times what neighboring farmers were seeing from better starting land. 3 times. Not because he had spent more, because he had thought differently, and because an older man with 43 years of looking at land as if it were a patient had told him about a technique nobody remembered to keep using. The man who had made the remark at the auction drove past in late April. He slowed. He stopped. He sat for 6 minutes. Then he got out and walked to the fence. Daniel was in the field. He saw the truck but kept working. Eventually the man called across, "What is that structure?" Daniel looked up. "Thermal mass greenhouse system." A pause. "What does that mean?" "Come back Saturday," Daniel said. "I'll show you." 4 farmers came on Saturday. 2 of them came back the following week with their own measurements and questions. One of them contacted an agricultural extension researcher at the state university, not Daniel, just told him what he'd seen, and the researcher drove out on a Tuesday and spent 4 hours walking the operation. He asked Daniel where he had learned the technique. Daniel thought about how to answer that, then said, "An older farmer, Harold Briggs, he had the land next door. Can I speak with him?" "No," Daniel said. "He died last year." The researcher was quiet for a moment. "Did he leave any notes?" Daniel went into the house. He came back with 2 agricultural bulletins from 1978, the ones Harold had shown him, and a single sheet of paper in Harold's handwriting, notes from one of their Thursday conversations. The researcher read it carefully, then looked up. He understood this more completely than most people who published on it. Daniel looked at the paper. "He understood most things that way," he said. Daniel Carr still farms those 18 acres. The soil that was written off now tests at organic matter levels that put it in the top 15% for the county. He runs 4 of the 14 frames in active thermal mass configuration year-round. The others he has sold or lent to neighboring farms who wanted to try the system. He has never made a large income from it, but he has not lost a season. He thinks about Harold on Thursdays. Not every Thursday, just sometimes. When the light is a particular angle across the frames in the late afternoon, and everything inside is growing in a month, when nothing outside should be, he thinks about a man who showed up at a gate with a jar of preserved something and a way of looking at land as if it already knew what it wanted to become. There is a single greenhouse frame at the northeast corner of the property that Daniel has not modified, has not used, has not sold. He planted one thing beside it, an apple tree. He chose it because Harold told him once, in passing, on a Thursday, that his late wife had made the best apple preserves he had ever tasted. The tree is 3 years old now. It has not yet fruited. Daniel is not in a hurry. He learned from a man who knew that the things worth waiting for take longer than anyone expects, and are worth every cold morning you spent tending them before anyone believed they were real. The Farmer's Ledger, more stories from the land.